Hello. Okay, yeah, my microphone's on. My name is Ramirez. You can call me Frogbear or Ogie. Those are nicknames. Um, let's talk about Chapter 1, Reality Tunnels. Now, uh, I should credit the fact that I learned about, or at least I'm going to start using the term reality tunnel, because it was something that I was describing just over and over and over again. Like, it was something that I was constantly trying to grasp at, but the word, or at least the concept, didn't come into my purview until I was watching Patrick Ryan on the Stoa. He's basically the person that heads all of most of the videos that I've shown about or at least I don't know how to describe it, but I was looking at a video of his explaining who he was. He has something to do with the Zach Vorhe, that Google guy. But interestingly enough, I just was watching his "Who Am I" video, and in watching that, I realized that we have something in common. We watched, or at least he lived through a portion. He lived through the time where all of the jobs were exported to China, right? So he got to live very interesting events that occurred in his life. And for me, I experienced that, but towards the end of that era, because my father was somebody who experienced that turmoil economically. But what my dad decided to do after that with his life is essentially what left our family the way it was. But there were a lot more internal factors that went into this. But I never fully watched, like, it takes me time, and it's not usual that I'll watch like one series of videos back to back to back. Like, I try to do it in a way where I could really digest the material that I'm looking at. And I was far more focused into cybernetics right now. And so right, using cybernetics, right, while watching his video, I was watching him use system science to explain a variety of events that happened in history, right? And like, he basically gave me the idea of how to explain this. This is why it's called Chapter 1, Reality Tunnels. What I've been looking at since 2018 was I was trying to describe what was occurring on a global scale, but on a cultural scale, and why there was a constant, like a repetitive nature with a message, with iconography. It's a constant bombardment on the existence of who we are as a people, and how this largely shapes who you are. So, one of the things I could say is how Marvel movies. That's not really a good example, but there is something to be said about how there was a very no, it's not a really good example. I think a better example is that video where they show kids a picture of Jesus, but they show, right, they have a picture of Jesus and they have a picture of Ronald McDonald, and they ask the kids, "Who's this?" The kids say, "I don't know," but they'll look at Ronald McDonald and they'll be like, "That's Ronald McDonald. That's McDonald's." There's this whole thing of how your brain can be hijacked to recognize certain images first, right? It's, I'm not going to say that you're programmed to, but the reality tunnel, the conveyor belt that we're living in, that's what it puts on the forefront. And obviously, that's if you're the sort of person who, you know what I mean? It's all based on your environment. It's all based on what's your initial surroundings, that will essentially kind of slap onto you, because it's always either being introduced to you, bombarded to you, played on the radio, seen on television. It's either through interactions with friends, this and that. Um, right? It will largely build and compound. It's a compounding factor issue, because these are the images that you're digesting visually, and as people are now, they're more visual than anything else. So these were just things that I was just noticing while watching the trends, because I have a very interesting memory where I remember certain things that occurred during certain years, and with me paying attention to how all of this was progressing, um, I could say that I noticed that there was always a clear identifiable force or exertion of power, exertion of influence that influence people to go a certain direction. And hence why learning the term reality tunnel was super important to me, but it was just the way that he explained his story. Because he starts his story, right? He's born in the 80s, but he starts his story with Adolf Hitler, which is hilarious to me. But, right, I'm researching that right now, and that research led me to the sexual revolution, led me to Kinsey and the Kinsey Institute, and it led me to understand the current reality tunnel that we're in. So I should check the time. 5 minutes. Wow. So where we are now, I've noticed that what we're watching right now with the red pill movement, the man dynamic, the woman dynamic, and how there's this current like social dynamic that's just gotten tilted, right? With that, I noticed that these are just symptoms. These are just symptoms of the issue at hand. But I accidentally discovered the source of it, which was Kinsey, and how his research was largely used to change the laws in this country. And it is kind of funny that with those change in laws, you saw a spike in certain crime rates. I would show the video, but that video would get me banned because it's a part of a documentary, and what it says, I already feel like I'm putting a big target on my back because of the correlations that I'm making, and how the certain rise of a corn industry that rose was largely putting subliminal messaging inside of their magazine to, because at the end of the day, you have to remember what kind of people these are. They're not, you know what I mean? Like, you had a large movement now of men walking away from corn, but back in those days when learning to self-regulate wasn't that big of a thing, we had the rise of alcoholism, we had the rise of narcotics, but with that also came the drug war, which could never really solve anything. You see where I'm going with this? It created a very interesting reality tunnel from everyone from the 70s on to the early 90s. Around the early 90s, things just seemed to disappear, right? All of these issues, right? Like the crack era was over. Like there's no more narcotics issue. But meanwhile, people started drinking lean. People started drinking that cough syrup. And at that point, you will see a drastic trend in pharmaceutical narcotics gaining a lot of traction during this point in time, is what I'm saying. Right? It's all a part of creating this reality tunnel. And but it's hilarious how all of this starts at the end of World War One. I think, by and large, what was discovered by the people who were largely funding eugenics, and the people who were largely funding this new school of thought, this new school of I need to find me the best eggheads to give me the best research so I can either make my businesses more efficient, and in darker cases, what I'm suggesting is, how do I steer politics? I can already pay off these officials, but how do I do this on the public arena? And well, you can largely see what happened with marijuana, and how that largely created reefer madness, and then how that largely incarcerated a huge percentage of people, and that's years that they can't get back in life. So there's this whole trend. There's this whole notion of a system science. Like, this science had to be born somewhere, because drastically over the time, nothing ever happened. That's kind of the key point that I'm getting to. Why did nothing ever occur if some of these things were so egregious or so blatantly idiotic from the very beginning? And we largely have to address the reality tunnel. We have to address the systems that are designed to put certain issues in front of our face. Think about how the television largely affected us. Think about how newspapers and propagandists were already largely, they had a very good foothold. I'm not going to say that right? We have freedom of the press. That's one of the things that's been constantly bombarded to you, that it's a trigger word because it triggers a notion. Like you'll notice that if it induces an emotion in you, you've been programmed. And this is where it gets really difficult for me to talk about, because addressing the elephant in the room means addressing that we've all been programmed to a large degree. And the only people who've really escaped that programming are people who break out of the identity complex. I need a time, 10 minutes. With breaking out of the identity complex, you break out of the larger reality tunnel that's meant for you, right? So coincidentally, I was at the gym, and everybody in the car listened to reggaeton, Spanish, Latin music, like the new wave of it, and they asked me like, "Oh, do you like any of these songs?" I'm like, "Not really. Like, I don't listen to this. I listen to more like, right now, I have more of the reality tunnel of American rap. That's the reality tunnel that I'm in. It's either American rap, Joji, like just anything that's current, like, right? I'm always just jumping from one genre to the next, and currently the only thing that really hits in American culture is rap music. So, right, think about how these things are constructed, and the reason why we can assume that is because it's there. It's a mechanism that's affecting our life. In system science, it doesn't. You can't look at it as I'm gonna nitpick this, I'm gonna nitpick that. No, you gotta look at the music industry as a whole. I'm not gonna say rap music's the only thing, because I do listen to indie music, and I've been listening since 2010, right? And I've been listening to all the sad shit from either Epitaph Records, the screamo genre that kind of popped off a little, right? Like I've noticed the variety of things. That's why I just say music industry as a whole. But it's a mechanism in our life, alongside MTV, alongside what we hear from our friends, and that's where it usually comes into play. Where it's usually what we heard our friends talk about, the people that were around us. And that was how it used to work. Nowadays, you just get it from YouTube, or just the overall large trends that you see on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or whatever artificially created marketing campaign. I know, very complicated. But Cambridge Analytica is kind of the lynching pin of that point, because that was largely a think tank that was figuring out how to overall manipulate trends. And where are we now? Where are we with, right? How many people have been banned off the internet completely? I think that's 2. Andrew Tate and Alex Jones. And what were they saying that largely got them banned? What was the events that were occurring, right? These are just things that are compounding factors into us. And it just gets worse when you include movies, when you include because a lot of it was left as philosophy. The way I see it, either it's research that hasn't been put in front of us yet, but largely to some degree, somebody must have thought, hey, this young guy has a really good idea. What happens if I measure people's brainwaves, figure out and relate them to parts of the brain, and then repeatedly do this process to see what would occur inside of that person? And what are the sort of stimuli that occur in them, right? If you do all that research and development, and you figure out how to mimic those same brainwaves, and how to apply that to mainstream media, how to apply that to transition frames and news networks and television, right? Like, there's a very fucked up thing that you could develop here. And it's kind of why I'm like, damn, I really shouldn't talk about this. I'm 13 minutes in. Okay, I still got some time. But you build a very nasty picture. And the reason why I say that is because we're born into this world. From my research, our country was infiltrated at the end of World War One, in the sense that infiltration not by a foreign actor, infiltration by internal actors that were laissez-faire about the whole situation, but they found themselves in a conundrum. They had a bunch of labor strikes against them. They had laws that were put against them, and they felt shysted out of that one. So what do you think they did? They were like, oh, what happens if we start using our things? What happens if we start using our toys that are at our disposal? And then, you largely then had lobbyist groups, newspapers, funded politicians, like you had a lot of deliberate actions that were made in World War II, right? That were completely inducive to selling. Well, it's not that they planned to sell the steel to Europe, but it sure did make them a lot of money. So there were a lot of things, especially what I talked about a certain family and how they were the ones who used the law firm in New York to move a bunch of money over to Europe before the war started, made a bunch of money, and before the war ended, moved it all out. Like, come on, we gotta. There are things that occur that we have to quantify because these were the same people that were affecting the current time's inception of the reality tunnel that they wanted to create because during the 1920s, what happened with the Rockefeller Institution and then them molding and shaping our schooling system that is still molded and shaped by them. So, yeah, a lot to digest, and yeah, that's where I'm at. And it's all because I listened to one YouTube video, but it's merely me just describing the thing that I've been trying to put my finger on for so many years. And it's kind of great to get a grasp on something that I've always just been quantifying in my life. And that's kind of why people like who think like this tend to find themselves in depressive states, is because you're seeing the reality and you're looking at like how people are just logically, duh. It's like, hey, if you do that, you're gonna hurt yourself, right? And then just be like, wow, people don't change, right? It gets you really sad. But the reality of the situation is that their worldview has largely been shaped to be as boink boink, like, hey, you know what I mean? Like, you're stunted. But either way, very interesting research. Of course, I never plan on abstaining myself. Doing this research and reading about this stuff is amazing and interesting. So yeah, my name is Ramirez, and yeah,